Hello and welcome both to those of you here in person and many more who are online for this event, entitled From Disaster to Completion. What can government learn from the Universal Credit story? So we need to start, I think, in February 2014, when Ian Duncan Smith, whose brainchild Universal Credit is facing furious members of the Commons Work and Pensions Committee, and he is in deep, deep trouble. By that date, almost 1 million people were meant to be receiving Universal Credit. In practice, just 5,000 were, and they were the simplest possible cases. Single, under 25-year-old childless males who were not even claiming housing benefit. A year earlier, the programme had hit such trouble that it had been entirely reset, although IRES had failed to tell the committee that, insisting it was still all on track to be completed in 2017. He found himself repeatedly accused of obfuscation of smoke and mirrors. Those were the darkest days, both operation and politically, and they've been pretty well covered. They've been covered by David Freud in his book Clashing Agendas, which is an account of his time as a minister, and by us in a previous report on Universal Credit, happily called From Disaster to Recovery. And for this event, that's our jumping off point. Not what went wrong, but what went right, what then went right. To the point that while there are still people on legacy benefits, DWP is sufficiently confident of their transfer to Universal Credit to have recently wound up the programme board, with the result that Neil Cooling, who is sitting here, the senior responsible owner of UC for the past decade, and the person without whom, at least in my view, UC might never have made it, has left that post. He's gone on to be Director General for Fraud and for Disability Benefits. Two easy and non-controversial items. Out of the frying pan to the fire, Neil, is all I can say. You must be a glutton for punishment. It's excellent to have him here to talk us through his view of the recovery process and the lessons that may or may not have, maybe from that for the rest of the government. It's equally good to have on the panel Tom Loosemore to provide his analysis of that. Tom was a founder member of the government's digital service who played an early part in the rescue of UC, and he's since co-founded Public Digital and co-authored a recent report for Nesta on how to transform government services. We also have Jill Rutter, who, among many other things, is a senior fellow here with huge experience of government success and failure after working in the Treasury at Number 10 and at Defrelator, while for many years shaping IFG's research. If this runs on for 1 second past 6 o'clock, Jill is going to exit stage right for a future commitment. And finally, we have Tom Waters, Associate Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and an absolute wizard on tax and benefit policy. The core focus of this event is on how UC was recovered and what the lessons may be from that. But with the programme nearing completion, we should not do that without taking at least a look, if only a brief one, at UC's impact. Has it done what it was intended to do as it rolled the original 6 benefits into one? So we're going to start with Tom Waters that is, but not before asking Neil to explain very briefly what DWP means by completion of the UC programme and how far it is from that.
Yeah, so we've got about 500,000 Employment Support Allowance cases to pull over onto Universal Credit. That's down from the 880,000 we started with. Very roughly, we call about 90,000 ESA customers in every month. So if you can do the maths in your head with 500,000 still to go, that means we'll have finished calling people by the end of September, and that will then give us 4 or 5 months to work through those remaining cases and pull them onto Universal Credit. So all the design work is done, all the technical work in the service to pull cases over to Universal Credit. It's just the act now of people claiming, and they are claiming. I was saying to Nick just a bit beforehand, people are claiming in very high numbers. They're responding to the invitation to come onto Universal Credit. So we're practically done, and that's why we stood the programme board down. There's nothing more for me to do other than be pleased that it's going to be finished.
Right, great. Tom, talk to us about the impact.
Sorry, Tom.
Great, thanks. Well, I have some slides. I don't know where you're going to be able to see them.
No.
Oh, right.
No.
Oh, there we go. There we go. I was going to say, that would make things a little more challenging. Great. OK, well, it's great to be here to talk about this. When I started working economics, Universal Credit was just getting started. And, well, it was 2014. It was about 3 years away from being fully rolled out. And whenever I spoke about UC, I used to make a joke and say, you know, it's great to see that something's never changed. Whereas now, of course, it has changed, and UC actually has been rolled out, so that's good. Okay, so let me just give a bit of an overview of kind of how I see the impact of the reform. So here I'm just going to show how much benefits you could get under the old system, the legacy benefit system, for an example person working at the minimum wage. So it used to be that you could get Jobseeker's allowance. On top of that, if you're a renter, you get housing benefit. If you had kids, you could get child tax credit. And if you worked enough hours, you could get working tax credit too. And so this resulted in this rather strange looking beast, which had these cliff edges and these flat portions. And I think it's fair to say no one who was designing a benefit system from scratch would sit down and think, this is the way to do it. And amongst other things, it also meant that in order to get all your benefits, you had to put in multiple applications for different parts of the system. Compared to that, UC, which is shown by this black line, looks remarkably simple. It's just a nice, quite smooth amount that gets smoothly tapered away. And it means that you only have to take up one benefit. So in many ways, I think it's fair to say, you know, this looks like a much more rational system. And part of the point of UC was to rationalize this hodgepodge of benefits that we had before. But that said, what's not shown here is there actually remain a lot of cliff edges in benefits and support. Things like free school meals, healthy start vouchers, Scottish child payment, and more and more and more. And all of those things you can go from earning just under a threshold to just over a threshold, and suddenly you lose your whole entitlement. And importantly, all these things, apart from one, all these things are not administered by DWP. So the way that the system interacts with other parts of government perhaps hasn't had the same kind of rationalization. Okay, so that's how the reform kind of affects people's entitlements. How does that play out across the whole population? Well, the short answer is there's lots of winners and there's lots of losers. So here I'm going to just carve people up according to whether they win or lose out of UC across the whole working age population of claimants. And if we start with the overall, we start with everybody, how many people actually see very little change, less than £200 a year? It's actually not very many, maybe about 20%, something in that order. A somewhat larger number see somewhat bigger gains or losses. And then there's a significant number of people who see really quite big changes, £2,000, £3,000, even £4,000 a year. So UC makes a big difference to the kind of support that people receive. And when we look across different family types, we can see that some of these changes are much more common than others. So couples with children are much more likely to gain. Almost half of them gain at least £2,000 a year, for example, whereas singles without children are more likely to do considerably worse. Now, part of the rationale for UC was to make work pay. That was particularly at the beginning, and actually we heard quite a lot. So how's it done at that? So here, one way of thinking about how it makes work pay is what economists sometimes call the effective tax rate on work. If you get into work, how much of your earnings do you lose in the form of higher taxes, income tax, NICs, and lower benefits? So I'm going to show that for the legacy system, the system that predates UC, and for universal credit. You see that actually when we look at people who have relatively low tax rates, that's quite a strong incentive to get into work. They're actually quite similar numbers under the legacy system, and you can see as I build this up, relatively similar fractions of people have these lower tax rates. But things actually start to change once we get up to higher tax rates. And you can see that for UC, almost no one has a tax rate of more than 70%, whereas under the legacy benefit system, it wasn't uncommon to have tax rates of 80, 90%, even more in some cases. That's for the whole population. If we look at lone parents, a group we tend to think are particularly responsive to financial incentives to work, the effects are even sharper. And finally, I think there's some reason to think that perhaps UC, as well as being a more rational system in one sense, has also become perhaps a more rigid system. An important fact about UC is that it's assessed monthly and it's paid in arrears. So the government looks at how much you earn over a month, and then after that, it pays you how much you're entitled to. That's resulted into the very high profile 5-week wait when you first apply for UC before you get your first payment. It also means that those that get paid every 4 weeks from their job rather than every month have an awkward situation where 1 month in the year they get 2 payments in the same month from their job, and that means they get much less UC. That can make it more difficult to budget. And lastly, UC bundles together short and long-term support. So under the old system, we had Jobseeker's allowance. That was based on your current earnings, and you got cash quickly out to people, about a week. And that was good for short-term hardship. You've lost your job, you've got no income right now, we're going to give you JSA, pretty much today. And at the same time, we had tax credits, which are assessed over a whole year. And one advantage of that is it's kind of averaging out fluctuations. It's saying, we're just going to look at how much you earn over a kind of a long period of time and make that your support based upon that. And that's perhaps better for thinking about longer-term earnings top-ups. By its nature, by integrating these things together, UC can only do one, kind of splits the difference and chooses a monthly assessment period. And so for all that there is to say in favour of UC, I think some of these points are something to consider against. So bringing things together, I think it's fair to say the legacy system had clear rationalities. No one would have sat down and designed the legacy benefit system. And the UC does improve on these, and it gets rid of the very weakest work incentives, and in that sense it's achieved one of its key goals. But it retains a lot of these awkward cliff edges, and its rigidities perhaps in some sense make it more difficult for those that have non-standard circumstances, although in some cases quite common circumstances. Is it better or worse? I think many degrees that's in the eye of the beholder. Thanks very much.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Great. Would you like to comment on that? Do you think, has the impact been what it was meant to achieve?
I think pretty much it has had the impact we thought it would. I led the policy design team that wrestled with some of these issues. And the point is, if you're ever in the space of trying to design a new system, there are consequences to the choices that you make. If you're, there were 7 different rates of disability allowance, for example, in the 6 different legacy benefits. So you can't have 7 in your new system. So some people will gain from that and some people will lose, but pretty much we were targeting extra help on families, particularly about on lone parents, because we knew lone parents were more responsive to those kind of incentives. So it's shaping pretty much as we thought, although a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. So there's been lots of quite big events in history since then.
Yeah. Jill, do you have any comments on the impact?
No, just one thought that I think is quite interesting. I was talking quite a lot, seeing the government coming under a lot of grief about winter fuel allowance and pensioners. And someone commented today on either X or Blue Sky that it's so much easier to take money away from certain groups than it is from others. And I think we see that in both tax and benefits, that actually some of those numbers that Tom illustrated with the change of people from legacy benefits to UC are really quite big numbers. I mean, £4,000, £2,000 for people not on very high incomes. Those are really big changes. And yet there are other areas where, remember when Philip Hammond couldn't equalise employer and self-employed NICs, which was what, a cost of a cappuccino a week, and there was outrage. And I think it's really interesting how irrational the policy debate very often is, and how much more willing we are to subject people on benefits, working age benefits in particular, to very big income changes, and how reluctant we are to see losses on taxpayers or indeed losses on pensioners.
Yes, depends how articulate people are, I suspect, in part. Tom, do you have any comments on the impact?
Just 2 very quick ones. I think sometimes a little bit dangerous to look at this purely through the lens of economics. There is a cost to applying to 4 or 5 different types of benefits, falling on new benefits and falling off old ones, in terms of the cognitive overhead people have and the mess they might get into when they get things wrong, which is sadly inevitable. So I do think simpler is better just for that reason alone, and that's quite hard to catch in those numbers on those slides. And I think the second point that maybe leads into the second part of this discussion is those previous benefits, they got changed, once every 6 months was the quickest you could change them?
18 months.
18 months before you could change anything on them. UC changes every week. And that ability to now adapt the thing, that is an improvement. And what you do with that improvement is politics. But previously, you really couldn't change anything.
Yeah. I've got one question which now your direction for fraud is very relevant. But the 5-week wait has been one of the bugbears about it. People complain about that a lot. Is it the fact that it is online and digital which has been an advantage of UC, I think? Does that make it difficult to change because it is at greater risk of fraud? Being online, you can get into it.
So there are certainly new frauds come from being online, as we're all finding. I mean, fraud is growing across the whole society. I get into trouble when I say that with Public Accounts Committee. They don't like me saying that, but it is true. You know, the question of the initial assessment period is one of, you know, if you pay a benefit in arrears, then you need a period in which to assess it. And that's where that initial assessment period comes from. If you try and pay a benefit like universal credit in advance, you'll have real issues around administration if you try and do that. So that's why in the design choices that set of ministers made, they went for the arrangement we've got now.
Right. Great. Well, at this point, I think we move on to the sort of the second part of this, which is the recovery of UC from the disaster I very briefly outlined earlier. So, Neil, would you like to tell us, from your point of view, how it was done?
Yeah, so Nick said to me that I've got a lot of slides, so I am. So it's going to be a sort of blip through here. The good news is, if you're interested, is we've published all this material, and there's a citation at the end of my slides. I don't know if people will get them after the event, but I'll try and set that up there. So here's the 6 lessons that my team, this brilliant team who delivered universal credit and turned it around, as Nick said, from it was a disaster to success and successful completion now. I'm not going to read those out, but you'll see that in there is a lot of focus on doing things simply and doing things well, which seems a bit trite to say, but when you're running a big program the size of universal credit, it's incredible how difficult it is to do things well, because things are going wrong all of the time, and that is the nature of big programs of change. They are not like they say in the plan. They hit events, and universal credit has hit Scottish devolution, extra powers to Scotland, Brexit. It's hit the first global pandemic in about 100 years, an energy shock, and a war in Ukraine. And those things mean you have to be adaptive, you have to be resilient, you have to be able to respond, and those are what those 6 things up there talk about. Now, you know, I've talked here about an empowered culture. It's something that Tom brought in. Tom and I worked on the Reset team together back, trying to pull universal credit from the abyss. And the truth was that we had to build an empowered culture, one that allowed decision-making to be at the lowest possible level, because if you escalate everything to the top, everything slows down, and also people don't bring their genius into the work. Always have a plan B. Ian was my program director. You know, we were the terrible twins of universal credit, really. And he always had a saying, plan B. Mine was, the plan is the plan until it isn't. What does that mean? It was often there's lots of, I mentioned, stuff outside causing you to have to change tack, change approach. But you need people to stay focused on delivery. I think I heard somebody say to me last week that the civil service prides itself on its agility, its ability to turn and adapt to new governments and adapt to new ways of thinking. But you also need to be able to keep delivering on big change programs. And that's why we have the plan is the plan until it isn't. Momentum is key. There's a reference here to sharks having to keep swimming, moving forward. At some points of this program, progress was incredibly slow. You could almost needed a microscope to measure it. And at other points, it was incredibly fast. In 2018, we did 3/4 of the whole rollout to job centres in 9 months, having spent the previous 4 years doing the first quarter. So it's not linear, but you need to try and find ways to keep moving forward. And in 2018, 2019, we had a big problem because the Brexit impact was causing the fracturing of the then governing party, which was then a minority. And we couldn't get the legislation through Parliament that we needed for the next phase. So we had to find ways of appealing to Parliament to allow us the powers to go through there. Test and learn crikey, we go on and on about this in the programme. I go on and on about it in Public Accounts Committee now. It really is the way, and it's fantastic that the new government has adopted a test and learn approach as well, learning from the old, I think. It really does mean that you keep it small, you learn what all the mistakes you're making are before you try to go to scale, which is why we go slow, 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 and then very fast when we're ready to go, which is why we're doing all of the ESA cases in a little over 12 months, when people would have said that'll take you years, because we know what to do now. Play hardball on scope. There's lots of scope changes. I mentioned some of them. What you can do if you're the SRO is then negotiate really hard. So the civil service has a bit of an experience of just taking stuff on board without a murmur and saying, yes, Minister. Well, I always said yes, Minister, to when they had a policy decision, but when they had a policy decision, I would negotiate quite hard with them about how much time I needed within the programme. And between friends in this room and broadcasting, I always made sure I slipped a bit more time in, because when I took over the programme, it had zero contingency in it at all. The tyranny of the timetable. I mean, you know, people were making jokes like Tom about how long it was taking and others, but it's incredibly important not to be driven by the timetable, be driven by user need, be driven by the experience of claimants and what you're learning. And sometimes that means you have to say, I'm sorry, that timetable doesn't work. And that is often seen inside of the UC story here. We were never driven by the timetable. It's the one thing I would let go in order to stay within cost and stay within the ambit of the vision ministers had for it. Transformations do take time. So we will sign an SRO letter, senior responsible owner letter, and I would always negotiate hard on every edition of my letter for more time where I needed it. Bring everybody in. It was incredible in the 2013-14, within government, everybody was suspicious of UC, could it deliver? We took an approach of real transparency and bringing people into the team and trying to get them feel like they really wanted to see UC delivered. And that paid dividends in the really difficult times like COVID, when we had to call for help within government to ask for colleagues to support us. Brace the opposition. I put a point in, you'll face lots of opposition trying to change this. And UC was no different. Jill, you might think it was easy to change the rates of benefits like this. We faced the most sustained opposition I've ever encountered in my life. I did 10 select committee hearings in a little over 18 months. There were over 1,000 PQs within a year. I mean, Parliament threw absolutely everything they had at us, and at that point, it was a minority government. I've never witnessed or experienced anything like it. But you need to be a bit stubborn, as the slide says here. Yes, you need to be responsive as well. The programme had become in 2013 a fortress. It was criticised for it. In 2018, the NAO were really good. They pointed out to me that, Neil, you're becoming a fortress again because of these attacks on us. And we turned that around, threw the doors open again, and went out to stakeholders and said, come and help us with this next phase. Finally, the role of the SRO, and I think I've kept it to time, which is incredibly important, I think, to understand if you're an SRO. You are not the decision maker. You know, ministers make decisions. Big policy decisions. What you are, though, is the controlling mind. You're the person who's trying to think 1, 2, 3 steps ahead when the now is so intense for everybody else. And I think, you know, if I did one thing well, it was on UC to be 1 or 2 steps ahead. So when, for example, in 2023, we needed to find some savings because of the post the emergency budget, or we had to, we had to change the timetable. I already knew when I was changing the timetable how I'd bring the timetable back a bit later, because my thinking was 1, 2 steps ahead. So that's it. for a very swift lessons learned. But as I say, on those, if you look in the deposited papers, you can see our full learning there. We've tried to set that out.
Great, Neil. Thanks a lot. Tons of questions to that. Tom, come and talk about this from your side.
Can I just say, I don't think, I was just thinking DWP ministers and officials are quite a lot braver than some of their counterparts elsewhere.
No, that's just Neil. Thank you, Neil. My brief is to sort of contextualise this a little bit more broadly for the rest of government. I spent the best part of a year in 2013 working very closely with Neil, helping reset universal credit. And it gets in your blood, so I'll use some references there. 3 big lessons, I think. The first one Neil's alluded to is that public services are often complex, not just complicated, they are genuinely complex. You cannot predict them up front. And I think the civil service broadly needs to deal with complexity at all, not just better at all. Secondly, I think test and learn should be the norm for most public services, and it isn't. It is in UC, but that's still the exception. And finally, and Neil's touched upon this again, I think broadly public service reform, amongst several other things, but new leadership behaviours needs to be right at the heart of that. So digging into these a little bit more deeply, 30 years ago I was here, this is the Channel Tunnel. I'm an engineer by training. Channel Tunnel's pretty blooming complicated. It's a big endeavour, 13 billion quid. What it isn't is complex. So with a complicated programme, you genuinely can plan up front what you're going to do, roughly when you think you're going to do it. You can predict. You may get it wrong, but in theory you can predict. Welfare state reimagination, as bold as you see, you're in deep complexity land. Here, simply impossible to predict up front the real world outcomes of what you're going to get, how you're going to design your service design, your operating model, let alone the benefits. And there's a quote here from Pat McFadden just before Christmas, which thrilled me to hear, with him saying, "You cannot kill complexity with cleverness when it comes to improving public services." I think a lot of the default ways that the civil service operates assumes you can plan things up front, you can predict things up front, and if you can't, you're not clever enough or you've not worked hard enough. The business case process, even things like people, property, all of this assumes a process of upfront design and then your assurance. I mean, it's really interesting that the fundamental backstop of assurance for these programs was previously the Major Projects Authority, was then the Infrastructure Projects Authority, and now is the National Infrastructure and Services Transformation Agency. Thanks, Jill. I was relying on you for that one.
See the agency or authority?
New authority, probably authority. All the bosses of those are infrastructure people. The person currently running NISTA used to run Crossrail. I think that's an issue. I think you need, if you're going to assure things, I think the default should be dealing with the complex real world reality of most public services where you really can't predict things up front, not reliably. My second point is, how do you make test and learn the norm for most public services? Not if you're building a motorway or a submarine, but if you're doing any, if you're, say, you're Liz Kendall and you want to get Britain working again, I would argue that is a very complex endeavour. I would be wanting to make sure that the lessons learned from UC were adopted around how do we get a new jobs and careers service that encompasses a whole ecosystem of getting people back into work. I would say one would hope that test and learn would be the approach taken there. I'm not sure it will be, because I think Neil's quite exceptional, both as a human, and I mean that deeply, he's an amazing human, but also because he was exceptionally powerful in his role. He was the 6th SRO in 4 years, at which point, if you're a minister, you can't fire him. And he's good enough to make hay with that reality. And not every SRO has that privilege or that Machiavellian instinct, frankly. So test and learn is very definitely not the norm. And let me just quickly dwell on test and learn. What is it? What it is how do you get feedback? Test the thing that matters most, learn from the results, speed up that loop. And the art is working out what matters most. I mean, Neil's already alluded to making sure that before you scale something, you actually better make sure it actually works at small scale before you go large scale. But it's even more fundamental than that. It's like, okay, when we did the reset in 2013, we have people from all sorts of different bits of government here, from HMRC, from local authority, from Cheltenham, from the government digital service. The thing we need to work out that matters most is, can this team work together at all? How do we test that quickly? What's the right operating model for doing this? What should be online? What should be done face-to-face? What should be done remotely? How do we make this secure? Now we're ready to start scaling this. A million questions like that need to go into this feedback loop because you simply can't predict them up front. And it requires an intrinsic humility to not feeling your cleverness depends, your status depends on coming up with the right answer. It requires radical multidisciplinary working across the civil service and within the functions and disciplines of the civil service. It requires your team to be radically open with others about what they're learning. People aren't going to trust you if you're not open with what you're learning. That means what went wrong as well as what went right. And it means getting stuff into reality as quickly as possible. I think almost the most amazing thing about the recovery of universal credit was that after I'd left, was they went live with, 100 people in Sutton?
No, 24.
24 people were the first recipients of universal credit in one postcode sector of Sutton. Now, I can tell you now, the systems underpinning the operating model underpinning universal credit were very far from being mature when those 24 people were the first people on it. There were probably about 150 people making sure none of those people starved, by the way. But there was the only way to get the reality of 24 people claiming, get that feedback loop around some of the core aspects of the policy before you even think about the operating model, the way you scale this to more. And it's not a phase, it's not a pilot, it's not something you do at the front, it's an intrinsic way of being and way of working. And I think I'm amazed Neil didn't mention the achievement of surviving the pandemic. Universal credit, pretty much, we work all over the world, my consultancy, pretty much the only Western welfare system that survived the COVID intact. And the reason it could do that is because the team were making change. I think it was like 7 or 8 changes a day you were making at the peak. And these are not just changes to software, these are changes to the operating training needed for people. That adaptability, that agility is pretty extraordinary, and it doth continue, and I hope it continues now Neil is moving on to much easier challenges like fraud. Good luck with that, Neil. So I would like this feedback loop to be the default, and I see some positive signs emerging. We've already heard that Pat McFadden is quite a big fan. That's encouraging. But there's more to it than that. You hear Darren Jones, CST, exploring new ways of how we might do funding approvals in a way that recognises that we might need to release funding when we've learned that we need it, or learn that we don't need it. How do we make things easier to stop that aren't working? That requires the Treasury to change its processes. I think that requires assurance to change its processes. But I think the conversation's moved on in a healthy way, but I still don't think it's the default test and learn. I think it still requires you to go against the grain. And that's why I think the leadership shift in behaviours is really, really important. And this is a sort of caricature in some ways, but I think there's some truism in it. You need to go from the solution being the thing, and that if you're a senior civil servant person, you need to be, I have the solution to this problem, minister, which ministers may want to hear, but you're frankly lying to them. Focusing on outputs, I'm going to deliver this thing by this date. It's the tyranny of the date point. The demands for certainty, how much is it going to cost? How many benefits am I actually going to get? How many people are going to have it on board on this and by what date? Keeping things closed, and the professional silos. You have policy in one thing, operations in another, technology elsewhere, and the twain shall meet. To shift to the empowered, team-based culture that Neil alluded to, and Neil was an absolutely exemplary leader of, that starts with recognising unless you meet people's needs, you've got nothing at all. To focusing on the outcome, like what do you want to achieve, Minister? That's the most important question. It's amazing the amount of programmes where you ask people on the team, what outcome are you what are you actually trying to do here? They'll say, well, I'm trying to deliver this system, or I'm writing this policy. That's not an outcome. More people in more work more of the time, protecting those who can't work, I can still remember it. That's the outcome for universal credit, hopefully. Test and learn, openness, and multidisciplinary. So that shift requires a different style of leadership. I think I'm not being critical of senior civil servants here, but they're very difficult leadership behaviours to adopt, regardless of your personal preference as a leader. And I do think Neil is an exceptional leader. I also think he had some exceptional advantages from being unsackable. And I think one of the challenges of public sector reform is, how do you make these test and learn style of leadership behaviours much easier? So to conclude, those three things, and I suspect some of you got finally some yeah buts in your head. That's all very well, talking about this test and learn stuff, but it doesn't fit the reality of being a civil service leader. And I hear this all the time. Ministers demand X, regardless of well, you can read the list. And I think the challenge, the way I respond to civil servants who say these things to me is, Neil did it. If universal credit can do it, why can't you? And a little bit of of cognitive behavioural therapy in people's heads is needed, whereby when they hear a yeah but in their head, they go, hang on, I remember universal credit. They did test and learn all the way through. They were radically humble. And that's, if they can do it, why can't we? And I'll stop there. Thank you. Oh, there's a book. We wrote a little pamphlet about all this stuff. It's got lots more juicy stuff about UC in it, which you can read. There's my shameless plug. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Recommend it. Tom, many thanks indeed. Jill, what do you...
Okay, I haven't got any slides, she said, so, and we obviously want to get on to questions, and I need to get to the theatre, sorry about that, which is why I'm going to make my massively exit, and you can all go on and talk for ages, because you just heard from Neil that timetables, deadlines, or whatever, you need a bit of flexibility and go with the flow. But I think a really interesting question, I think this comes to what Tom is saying as well, is that the challenge is how, without the licence of having a programme that is going as badly off track as UC was in 2013, do you get the licence to have these behaviours where, frankly, everybody had almost given up on UC? We saw the Secretary of State's special advisors briefing against the permanent secretary, then became unsackable because Jeremy Hayward came out in support of him and things like that. So how can you move to a place where you can have these behaviours that are very effective without it actually being against the backdrop that the thing is thought to be an absolutely dreadful disaster area? You have an unsackable SRO, and I think actually one of my first lessons, which would have been up there in highlights, is the benefits of SRO continuity, which Neil is too modest to mention, but I think actually if you want to say that, that's for me the thing that really, really stands out, is they had an SRO who stuck with this through thick and thin. Because I think a lot of the things that Neil and Tom are asking people to swallow are actually really quite uncomfortable, not just for civil servants, but for the ministers that they work for. Because you're asking people to commit a lot of money and their political reputation on something where, well, we set some timetables, but, well, we might adjust, those timetables may slip. I think it's a really interesting question to both of them. How do you get the licence to be able to adjust? It might not quite go in this right, we're going to have to adapt, we're going to have to move around. I mean, do you get into this sort of problem that people think, is this thing ever going to end? Remember, UC, as Nick said at the start, was supposed to be fully implemented on a hugely political deadline, and we know why they went for it, by the 2015 election, because Ian Duncan Smith thought if we didn't say that, the next government might very well come in and undo it, and the expectation then wasn't necessarily that there would be a decade and a half of Conservative government, Conservative or Conservative-led governments. So I think it's really interesting, how do you combine the sort of culture that Neil managed to create in UC with giving sufficient assurance to ministers that actually they aren't effectively signing their political death warrant by doing that? Neil said how many select committees he had to go to. Okay, so Neil's at the PAC all the time, at the Work and Pensions Select Committee, probably at some Lords Committee who have fussed about it too. But it's when the minister is repeatedly getting bombarded by his colleagues or whenever, having to answer urgent questions, and having to account to the Treasury for why is this thing under budget. I think, been too nice in some sense to complain too much about the Treasury's unhelpful role, I think, during UC, of deciding to go and try and grab savings, not just from other benefits, but also from universal credit, which undoubtedly made it made it find delivering some of its initial intentions much harder. And I think it is quite interesting that I take Tom's point that this isn't, as in inverted commas, as someone who's not an engineer, as easy as just building something. We used to use an analogy of the Olympics, that the easy part of the Olympics was building the stadium. You had a plan, got some land, did some mud washing, and you built it. You had the ticketing system, where you actually had sort of difficulties, because you could put a ticketing system out there, but it really depended for the outcome on how people interacted with the ticketing system of the Olympics. It's maybe so long ago, all of you were too young to apply for any tickets to the Olympic system, but I certainly didn't get what I wanted first time round, and lots of other people didn't. And you have something like Regenerating Stratford, where you are one little drop in a really big system. And I think within this, I think UC is falling between my sort of stadium in terms of the sort of implementation of the project, and the ticketing system is quite a long way from transforming the sort of nature of society, incentives to work and things like that. And we may have UC in place, but we also know that for a whole bunch of reasons, the government is facing a massive problem with workplace inactivity at the moment. So I would put it, on that complicated to complex. I don't think it's the most complex project that government has to do. So I think we ought to say it does tell us some really useful things about how to do a big implementation in troubled times, how to make it more difficult for yourself rather than less at the start, and then actually how to get it back on track. But I don't think it's telling us the sort of full solution there. But I think, big IT problems go wrong in lots and lots and lots of places. They don't just go wrong in the public sector. It would be my final one. Anyone who's worked in a business has a horror story of a terrible IT implementation there too. So kudos to the team, but it's really interesting. How do you get that license to have what you need, what it takes to manage a project well from the start without having to crater the project first?
Right. Best not done, yes. Sure, that's great. Tom, do you have any particular thoughts on the implementation?
One thing I was wondering a bit about what you were saying about scope was, it felt like during sort of the early middle part of it, there was a lot of kind of demands to tweak the system to kind of fit people that were in perhaps somewhat more marginal but quite needy cases. So the 5-week wait would be perhaps the highest profile example of that, but you can probably think of other ones as well. I was wondering, how do you think about kind of the trade-off between kind of getting a system that works well and works efficiently for the bulk of DWP customers versus having like that bit more discretion or whatever that helps with those more tricky cases? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Which one's answer? Yeah. So I mean, so what I meant by scope was, if people remember the Cameron government in 2015, it's elected on a promise of 12 billion welfare cuts. And those were the big scope changes I was trying to deal with. The political pressuring from Parliament comes after the 2017 election, where Theresa May loses her majority. And at that point, I've got all the legislation I need to do the first phase, and I just kind of tell the team the plan's the plan until it isn't. And there's lots of lobbying around. I mean, I think one thing I scooped over on my slides, I was trying to keep the time to allow for questions, was ministers. I mean, I had 10 secretaries of state during this period. Okay, ministers to a man and a woman were incredibly solid. And if you read David Freud's book, which is well worth a read, I fall out with Ian Duncan Smith after the 2015 election. He doesn't talk to me for 3 months because I tell him the timetable has to change. And he's saying to me, I don't think I'm saying anything that's not public knowledge here, I've just been out defending the timetable. Don't do this to me. We don't speak for 3 months, which is a bit of a problem when you're implementing a big programme or you're a Secretary of State. But Ian is very generous because he thinks about it. Ian's a very clever man. He thinks about it, and he comes to me at the end and says, I don't think you're asking for enough time, Neil. You need more time. That's the measure of that man. When he did that, that told the programme that I had the confidence of the Secretary of State, but also he understood the kind of things we were wrestling with. So ministers deserve a lot of credit through this, many, many ministers, because they could have, any one of them could have said, no, I don't want to do that. So they resist a lot of that pressure. partly because I'm saying to them, I can't change it and implement it at the same time. You know, I need some core DNA here in order to build this thing and get it going. You can change it later. It is very flexible, as Tom was saying, but just not now. Not when I'm trying to build the damn thing, was basically what the advice I was giving. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that many of the ministers were very good. There were one or two who thought they knew how to do it better than you did.
Yes, well, I mean, the truth about government is it's a partnership between politicians and civil servants. And, you know, I don't know if any of them had ever run big projects, but I had before, and I was trained, and I am, you know, all right at doing that. And they're politicians, so, you know, I wouldn't dream of telling them how to, you know, go out and campaign for something. Mm. So it's a partnership here, and the better the partnership is, the more successful you'll be, and that's nothing to be Tory, Labour or anything. Mm. It's about a way of working here. You know.
Yeah. Let's open it up to questions. If anyone could, if you do ask a question, could you say who you are and so we know the kind of way you're coming from. There's a roving microphone there. I'll take a couple, and there are some questions online, which I'll deal with in a moment as well. Yep. Why don't you start there?
Hello, I'm Fabian Chesler from Policy and Practice. So we help people get access to benefits, including universal credit, that they need through the Better Off calculator. But actually, I had the fortune, or maybe they had the misfortune, of having me as interim program director in the civil service for a short period of time. And Neil, I thought your presentation about the challenges and what you need to do was spectacular. And Jill, your question was bang on about you got licensed to do that because of where things were at. But how do we make it so that every program has the ability to run test and learns? Every program can take the time that it needs to get it right without a scope agreed with Treasury 3 years in advance, without having to do a business case with 30 approvals. So I guess my question is, if you had a magic wand to remove some of the restrictions placed on you from outside of the department, what would you wish away?
Great. Could we head the microphone over that way?
Thank you. Calvin Ngueno from Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Neil, a question for you. I suppose, how did you find managing your personal resilience just throughout your time as SRO, and also how you supported just the wider program team to do that as well? Thank you.
Great. Do you like to make a start on those?
Okay. Magic wand. License to operate. I mean, Jill's very astute. She was quite right. I did have a license to operate, but I took more license than I was given. Definitely. Which is probably why I'm not a permanent secretary. But you know, I say to civil servants, you've got more power than you think you have. Okay. So if you know the right way of doing this, do it the right way and take the criticism for that. You know, I did say to one Secretary of State once that if I followed what she wanted to do, this programme would certainly fail, and I wasn't prepared to do that. And you know, she then had choices about me and that. So I think we've got more power than we think. The other thing I'd say is stop dissing the Treasury. The Treasury were incredibly supportive of this programme, particularly in 2013. Danny Alexander, without him, it would not have survived. And they helped me find ways around the Cabinet Office controls, which was very important at the time. Tom will remember them well. You know, so in fact, the Treasury become real converts to this way of working. They loved coming to the programme board. They loved their involvement with it. So I'm not into that, oh, it's the Treasury's fault. That's a cop-out, everybody. If you're going to make difficult things happen, you need the Treasury on side. They perform a vital function in this country, and we're fools to think that in setting yourself in opposition to them, you're going to make any progress.
And the second question?
Oh, yes, personal resilience. Well, I had a great team. That's why I slept at night. The team were absolutely fantastic. I mean, they just did impossible things. We mentioned during COVID, and they did 90 changes in about 4 weeks to the service. I thought I was going to have to, hit them with an inoculation dart to get them to to have a rest. They were just incredible. When you empower people, you get so much more out of them when you try and direct them and tell them what to do. You know, there's a trick about giving the problem back when somebody comes to you with a problem. You say, yeah, and what do you think we should do about it? Even if you think you know the answer. And I had to really train myself in this because I come from that old school that Tom is asking to change. But I learned very quickly that if I wanted to sleep at night and if I wanted to get through this, I didn't expect to be SRO for 10 years, but if I wanted to survive this experience and make universal credit happen, I really wanted to make it happen, I needed to trust my team and trust the people around me. And that's what got me through.
Sorry, Tom. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. Neil made a joke about not being a perm sec. That's not a joke.
Well,
and I think that's really
you've taken
interesting.
the question out of my mouth. Carry on.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That,
if you keep someone that's 10 years in SRO.
Well, there's something really important here around if you are leading one of these major programs, and I'm not personally resilient enough to be able to do it, by the way, it would break me in weeks. You have to sort of feel the fear and do the right thing anyway. And someone once said to me, look, if you're not worried about being fired, you're not being bold enough. And that feels really important. But that feeling of needing to worry about being fired or damaging your career, that's what stops people going to the Treasury and saying, like, this Green Book advice, can I just bend it a bit? They'll go, yeah, like Neil did. But you've got to be pretty confident about your career to be able to engage in that way. And that's why I think public service reform needs to start with resetting those behaviours. That's probably ministers taking the lead to some degree, and the Cabinet Secretary and co as well.
Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment on the resilience point, because I think one of the really interesting things about civil service jobs is quite a lot of civil service jobs, you're just doing sort of tasks, you're doing sort of bits and tasks. Actually, being on a project where you have a product is immensely satisfying, I think, of actually where you can sort of see that you are making progress and getting towards something. And an awful lot of the ways in which we manage people's careers in the civil service stops anyone having any sense that they're actually seeing a project through and saying, I just wonder, did your team sort of stay with you? I mean, you obviously had this massive longevity and lasted, but did you find team members wanting to stick with the project because they were bought into it, or did they think, oh my God, I've done my time on this, that's my 9 months having to work here?
So at the
did
start,
they move on? How did it work?
At the start, nobody wanted to be involved because it was considered to be career suicide. By the end, people didn't want to leave, you know, which was part of what we were trying to build. My programme director stayed with me for 10 years. Ian Wright is superb, best programme director in government. Sadly, he's retired now. But the teams, in the end, I start thinking, no, I want these people, you know, almost like covert agents in some of the other projects, you know, to spread the gospel, as it were, here. So they do start to leave. I mean, some of them work in public digital now.
Sorry.
Others, stealing my people with much better offers. But, you know, I mean, seriously, I think you can't become this kind of fortress. It's really important. So there's lots of people take this approach. The way they try and teach projects in government now uses a lot of universal credit experience. And I try and, you know, do events like this to try and share stuff as well.
A couple of questions partly reflect what's coming online. When the reset was done, the build was done in-house, the second version of the IT, so to speak. I mean, A, how important was that? B, how far is that a lesson that government should do more of this IT building in-house rather than contracting it all out to the famous big people?
Well, I can't be critical of other people taking different policy approaches. What I can tell you is that by having control of the service, I could make things a lot cheaper for citizens because there was no markup, there was no sense of, and the private sector people were in. I mean, people think it's all civil servants. There were 500 originally kind of contractors coming in this to work on it, and they felt as passionately about making a success of this than any civil servant. So, you know, The skill was the ability to not have to have contract negotiations about even small changes. That's what took the 18 months that Tom was alluding to. So I'm a big fan of it, but there will be different approaches. You're buying something that's a standard product. You don't need to develop it yourself. You can just buy them off the shelf. So it's horses for courses here, but something, a transformational change like UC, you need the ability to test and learn, as Tom was saying. You need the ability to make mistakes. You need the ability to quickly pull out. And if you're in a contractual relationship, you've signed up for something, it's very hard to pull out when you see a problem.
Yeah. And is that being adopted more widely across government?
Well, it's certainly within the department. Different departments are taking different approaches to their transformation. So you see, HMRC is very much, it asks the market to build lots of things that the HMRC use, because users of HMRC services often have their own accountants and so forth. So as I say, it is different strokes for different folks here, but if you're going to embark on a big transformation IT program, I would advise people, if they can, to control the means of production as much as they could.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's something. The big shift is not where you build the software. Though you can argue that matters for something as unique as UC. I think the big shift that's happened, not just in UC but more broadly, is civil servants taking back control of the design of the service, which includes technology. And it was that being outsourced that led to many of the disasters, Post Office and others. Loss of control of the overall design, thinking you're building a motorway and buying a motorway instead of buying something that needs to evolve and adapt continually. And you need to understand and control it. You don't need to make it all yourself. You do need to understand and control what gets made.
Yeah.
Yep, right. I've got one very technical question from the first half of this, so to speak. But you said at the beginning that if you pay people in advance, there are real issues of administration.
Yeah.
The question is, what are those real issues?
Okay. Well, if you have a benefit that adjusts for earnings, you don't get your earnings in advance. So you either have to cope with the fact that this month they don't earn very much, but you're going on the basis of their last month's earnings, or you guess, or you do what some people have said, which is average it out. If you start averaging it out, it's really what period do you average it over? What happens with big fluctuations and so forth? So this is why we went for arrears. I mean, benefits pretty much been paid in arrears since 1988. So there's some changes. There's still some old pensioner benefits that are paid in advance, but mostly we do it that way because it needs to adjust. And then you decide what's your adjustment periods. If you have tax credits, they adjust over a year. So you get big overpayments and big underpayments.
I was just going to say the tax credit experience shows exactly why you don't want to have people accruing big overpayments, and you have to go to people and ask for it back, which I think shows one of the difference between the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions, which is the Treasury, when I was there, doesn't particularly, I mean, why should it? It's not its specialism, doesn't particularly specialise in people at the bottom end of the income scale, doesn't really understand, just assumes people at the lower end of the income scale are basically like the rest of us and just get paid less and have pretty stable incomes. I remember once going to see John Hills, who used to be a great sort of guru of all of this stuff, and he was sitting there with giant, big printouts. I said, what are you looking? He said, I'm looking at basically variability at the bottom, in the bottom decile of the income scale. He said, basically, these are people who have quite chaotic incomes. Some weeks they earn loads, get lots of overtime, other weeks they earn nothing, and that was before you had the gig economy and all of that sort of thing. So it makes it really quite difficult when you're trying to capture that. And asking people who don't have very much money, you give them money and then you ask for it back, is a massively difficult thing.
Indeed. Well, one of my favourite moments of the tax credits was when the government decided to write off overpayments of £25,000 a year just to get out of the problem.
Yeah.
Quite impressive. Any more questions from here at the moment? Yes, there's two more there, if you can whiz the microphone across.
Hi, Andrew Phillips, Policy and Research Manager at Phoenix Insights. My question is kind of a forward-looking one, which is I'd just be really interested to hear the panel's reflections on how the lessons learned from UC can be applied to the National Jobs and Careers Service design and transformation of job centres, which maybe has some interesting similarities and also some interesting differences to UC, but would be really interested to hear the panel's reflections. Thanks.
Thank you. Talent Master Christie, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. All major transformation programs will always attract very vocal lobbying from groups that are either fervently in favour or staunchly opposed to anything you're trying to do. Neil, one of your lessons was about including user views and feedback into your decision making, and I was curious to know how you include constructive user feedback into your decision making and your governance processes.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, should I take the second one first, and I'll cover jobs and careers? So, I mean, it's really risky. So I stood up in front of 100 stakeholders and said, I want to tell you what we're up to at the point of there was quite a lot of anxiety about sharing information, because at this point, it's a minority government and rocks are being thrown at us all of the time in Parliament and elsewhere. Metaphorically, I hasten to add. But you just have to be brave with these things. And you have to trust that people doing this kind of, who are into these discussions, want to have the discussions with you, are sincere about wanting to improve the system. So we took them through a whole series of, and said, well, if you're going to come in here to lobby, there's no point. But come and share your knowledge, your expertise. Meet my people who have knowledge and expertise as well. And we designed, so much of what we've done in the last few years has been co-designed with our stakeholders, even though they want to campaign on things like the 5-week wait and other such things at us. They came in and helped us design the enhanced support journey, which makes sure that vulnerable people on employment support allowance don't have their payments interrupted. So you've just got to seize your courage, or your courage a bit, and nail that to sticking place, or whatever Shakespeare said, and do some of that and give it a go and trust people not to abuse that. And pretty much they didn't. I mean, I was telling them stuff that was, in the end, would have been quite dynamite-wise, and nobody out of these 100 groups leaked that. The other thing we did was we worked with claimants, so I could take you into, effectively, we wouldn't call them labs because it sounds a bit spooky, but we would sit there with claimants all day. We'd pay them as well, and for their insight, and say to them, does this work? Doesn't that work? What do you understand by this or that? Which is why in Parliament, when I go back to Parliament and they'd say, we've had a great idea, we'd like you to do this. I said, well, I've asked claimants about that, and they don't think it'd be a good idea to write out 100 pages of what transitional protection means, because they just want to know, how is their money put together, and is this right? So that's what we've done. I think, it's really hard because it's almost against our core DNA as civil servants to go out and do some of this stuff, but it really works. And on the Jobs and Careers Service, absolutely we're using the lessons from UC, and in fact we've morphed the UC programme team into a team now to run the service, and they are in all the discussions trying to, and it's really hard because pressure on ministers to make things happen quickly, and the ministers' pressure on us to make things happen quickly, to adopt a test and learn approach here. So we launched our first Pathfinder in Wakefield. I think it was Wakefield. I don't do that side of the business anymore, so I'm a bit focused on fraud and disability now. But we've launched that. We're trying to learn, or take the learnings and apply them new. And in fact, to give the new government credit, it had spent a bit of time, probably with Tom and some of his colleagues in opposition, looking at universal credit and trying to work out how could it bring that ethos into the things it wanted to do in its time in government.
Yeah. Tom, yeah. Tom and Tom.
Jobs and Career Service, I think one of the dangers, I'd agree. I think it's quite hard not to learn the lessons from UC, one would hope. Although there's always a risk of, out with the old, in with the new. I think that's really interesting. What's the outcome? So the danger is you have a desire for an outcome that is to launch a new Jobs and Career Service. That's not the outcome. The outcome is raising the employment rate, which is going to require a lot more than just launching a new Jobs and Career Service. and a lot more touch points in people's lives than DWP has access to through job centres. It's about the NHS, it's about people leaving prison, it's about people in employment already. And I think it's slightly to Jill's point earlier that it's even more complex environment because it's multi-stakeholder engagement, and it's going to need an awful lot of humility around understanding, thinking you know what the answers are up front. It'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah. Tom, do you have any to add on that? Well, we kind of more or less reached time. So said we finish at 6, we'll finish at 6, 5 past. There will be a video and sound recording available of this on the IFG website, so shortly after the event, so please tell your friends and colleagues who may be interested to watch back and listen. And it just falls to me to thank the panel, well, 3 who are still here and Jill who has had to disappear. I think it's been really informative, interesting, challenging, and we just hope that government does indeed learn from this experience. Many thanks indeed, and thank you very much for coming.